Psychologists, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Content warning. These stories include discussion of assault, of both adults and minors, and disturbing events. Story 1. Not a psych, but I worked with parolees for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court, and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole, and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime, and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for him. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and if I parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I am all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. Story 2. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He'd only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end, the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole eval, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he had wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it. That he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later, and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job, and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Criminal defense lawyer here. A lot of those guys basically understand that we exist in the system, but that we're in a different role than they are. So they might kill a guy for shorting them on cash because he's part of their world, but not be upset at the prosecutor who sends him to jail for a decade because that prosecutor isn't. It's an interesting disconnect. An interesting and frankly pretty good disconnect to have, too. I would think it would be a lot harder to find people who might be trying to help these folks if they had to be more worried about their clients than I'm sure they naturally already are. Story 3. Obligatory, not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys, and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class, at school, in front of a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid. And because he didn't give a frick about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun, but the one who scared me was completely antisocial to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and done through a 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day he asked me, would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked, what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the crap out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her. Not being able to kick a kid out because of their disability is absolute bullcrap and is endangering people. Schools are supposed to be a safe environment, and crap like this really ducks that up. I mean, you definitely want to handle kids who have special needs with consideration and understanding, but when they've assaulted someone and pose a danger to others, I guess I don't know what I would do differently. I don't want them to miss out on getting help and education, but the person assaulted has a right to feel safe in a school. Ugh. Story 4. I'm a farm worker. The grandson of the guy I worked for was off the charts crazy. The grandparents couldn't control him. They bought him a .22 rifle. It had a trigger lock. They gave him the key and some ammunition. I locked it away because he was 6 years old. He threatened to shoot me, so I put him in timeout. He craps on the floor and laughs like a crazy butthole. I came to find out it was his sister's rifle I took away because a few hours later he came outside with his rifle, trigger lock off, bolt in, and ammunition in his pocket to kill me for taking away his sister's gun. Every day I had to deal with something like this. I've seen other workers chasing this 6-year-old kid with hammers. He was bat crap crazy. I have many stories about that year. I warned him to stop playing on the roof of a tractor. He would get hurt, and I'm not there to watch that bullcrap. He starts to get down and just seems to flop down on purpose. Landed stomach first on the back of the tractor. It would have hurt so bad. He cried for about 20 seconds, then cackled with laughter. He probably broke ribs, and I saw massive bruises on his stomach when he lifted his shirt to check for cuts. I watched him kill baby chickens by first saying how cute and petting them, then standing on them. He tortured the farm dog to the point it growled when he went near, and at one point I actually had to stop the dog from killing him. It had him by the back of the neck and was chomping down. He was crying, then burst into laughter. I can't speak enough about this kid to convey the frustration he would cause. He scared me, and I was on the farm where aggressive Black Angus bulls were a daily thing. Everyone hated that kid, and I'm relieved I'm not around him anymore. He's coming your way, psychologists. That's a frickin' serial killer in the making. It always starts with animal torture because of how vulnerable they are. Story 5. Therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obliged to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks, and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past. But she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag, and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well because you never know who's plotting your murder. Good life advice, not just regarding clients, but people in general. I feel like it might be off-putting for a therapist to have, a katana mounted above their desk and maybe some printed certificates saying that they're, black belts and stuff. It just doesn't seem the most professional, but, maybe not a bad idea. Story 6. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point, his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well and got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him, and she let her guard down. This time, though, he was now 20 years old and 6 feet tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6'4", 225 pounds. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out, and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth, pacing until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My brother-in-law is an amazing guy, and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Holy crap, every minute must have felt so long for her. Story 7. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man in his 30s-ish who was a S offender. He told me he used to marry women and then R their youngest daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abducted. He said that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He would drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice and friend's house, and while she was gone, he'd go back and R her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it's about the dominance and power that comes with having intercourse with them. Hess is rehabilitated now, though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful, because if he was, he is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of CP, his "I feel terrible" was transparent and so full of crap it was disgusting. My professor warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. This is freaking terrifying, and my blood ran cold reading it. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm all for rehabilitation over just punishment in prisons, and I'm aware that some of these people are this way because of problems in their brains that they struggle with, but I don't want to forgive and rehabilitate people who have done those things. Maybe that is hypocritical, but I can't. That's crossing a line. Story 8. Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously fricked up people for a living. Let's just say Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can possibly get in real life. She's usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing crap. She's tough as nails, and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently, this guy was either a serial artist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile, and she fit it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims, well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night. Despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison, she described it like a hunter/prey vibe on a real weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter-of-fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.